Welcome aboard. Join us as we dive into the legendary battleships of the two world wars, exploring their history, firepower, and the battles that would shape naval warfare. So let's set sail into the past. In the dying days of World War I, when finally the guns of the Western Front fell silent and the seas became tranquil from the fury of unrestricted submarine warfare, the United States Navy did not anticipate peace, but the next test. Even as diplomats negotiated disarmament, American shipyards were hard at work building the battleships of the future, ships that would rule the seas not just in sheer muscle, but in endurance, firepower, and national prestige. And from that vision was born the Colorado class. The third of her class would be named after one of the original 13 colonies. She would be USS Maryland. Her hull number was BB-46. Her story begins on April 24, 1917, only weeks since America had entered the war against Imperial Germany. The keel of Maryland was laid at the Newport News Shipbuilding Company in Virginia. She was no wartime hurried construction. No, Maryland was a creation of long-range vision, a ship of deliberate and exceptional engineering, built with the lessons of naval warfare still burning within living memory. Construction was slow going. Although the guns fell silent in Europe in November 1918, Maryland was still under construction. But peace would not deter her. She was launched on March 20, 1920. The ceremony was very dignified. With ribbons flowing and cheers from the great crowd, she slid down the ways and kissed the water for the first time, christened by Miss Mary Adele France, a daughter of a prominent Maryland senator. But she was not yet prepared for war or peace. Equipping her would take another 18 months. Arming, machinery, electrical work, and fire control installations had to be accomplished. She was a highly complex war machine, far more so than the coal-burning dreadnoughts of the past. On the 21st of July, 1921, USS Maryland was commissioned into the United States Navy. She was 624 feet long. Her beam was over 97 feet. She had a displacement of over 32,000 tons when she was loaded. And her armor was impressive, over 13 inches thick on her belt, and up to 18 inches over her main turrets. But what really made Maryland stand out were her guns, 8 .45 caliber 16-inch main battery guns, on 4 twin turrets, located 2 forward and 2 aft. These guns, and each separately possessed the punch to fire a 2,100-pound armor-piercing shell 20 miles, were the largest arms ever used with the U.S. Navy. Maryland was part of the last few to launch these new monstrous weapons. Her secondary battery consisted of 5-inch surface and anti-aircraft guns. She would eventually acquire more and more defensive weapons as the character of war evolved, but in 1921 she was already a sea fortress. In her early years, Maryland was assigned to the Pacific Fleet. She conducted shakedown cruises along the California coast prior to becoming a participant in fleet problems annually, enormous exercises in the Atlantic and Caribbean where new strategies were hashed out and tactics honed. She was an exercise in peacetime pageantry, showing American naval power while America indulged her isolationism and felt unease abroad. In the 1920s and 1930s, Maryland became a common sight throughout the Pacific Fleet. She steamed thousands of miles between San Diego, Pearl Harbor, the Panama Canal Zone, and ports as distant as Australia and New Zealand. Her crews were battle-hardened and disciplined even if their talents were never tested in actual war. But despite all her wartime service, or lack thereof, Maryland was continually being improved. In the mid-1930s, she had been fitted with upgraded fire control equipment and secondary armament. Her bridge was also upgraded. Aircraft catapults were installed on her stern to launch reconnaissance aircraft, an innovation that would prove its worth in the years ahead. The 1930s were ending, and Japan's empire stretched across East Asia. Germany under Adolf Hitler rearmed and grew more belligerent day by day. Italy invaded Ethiopia. Civil war in Spain. The League of Nations, set up to preserve peace, was paralyzed. America, weary from the First World War, sat on the far side of the oceans and watched, but the Navy was ready. By 1940, Maryland was stationed at Pearl Harbor year-round, along with the rest of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. It was a daring step by President Franklin Roosevelt, a calculated gamble designed to show American determination and discourage Japanese aggression. Pearl Harbor was lovely, but exposed. December 6, 1941. USS Maryland lay quietly at Ford Island within Pearl Harbor, moored on Battleship Row. She was inboard of USS Oklahoma. Oklahoma filled the space between her and open water within the harbor. Nothing much occurred on Maryland on that Saturday night. The crew relaxed. Liberty was granted to some of the sailors. Others sat composing letters home. Some men, if not all, did not even realize that by the time morning arrived, their world would be on fire. Exactly at 7:55 a.m., on that following morning, the sky over Pearl Harbor erupted in a cacophony of engine roar and gunfire. The Japanese attacking force had come down, 183 aircraft in the first wave, screaming out of the north. Dive bombers, torpedo planes, fighters, all highly trained months in advance to make this exact surprise attack. With deadly precision, Maryland, protected on one flank by the sinking Oklahoma, was not spared. Within minutes, Oklahoma took multiple torpedoes and began rolling over to port. Maryland sailors looked in horror as their sister ship rolled over like a dying leviathan, covering hundreds of men below decks, and then 2 armor-piercing bombs hit Maryland in the meanwhile. One landed near the forecastle, damaging compartments below. The other blew through the deck and shattered the wardroom, killing several men instantly. Anti-aircraft crews scrambled to their stations. In the midst of chaos, Maryland's gunners opened up, spewing tracers into the roiling smoke. At least one Japanese plane was shot down by Maryland's crew, but many more shrieked overhead. Blazes broke out on deck and below. Bulkheads collapsed. Fuel oil poured and burned. But Maryland continued on. Her watertight integrity was maintained. Flooding was kept at bay, her engines and generators operated. When the assault stopped at 9:45 a.m., the destruction was apparent. Maryland had been struck, but was still afloat, still fighting. She had lost 4 of her men, and 20 were injured, but compared to the destruction visited on Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia, and a few others, her survival was virtually miraculous. In the days that followed, Maryland remained at Pearl Harbor. Her crew helped to rescue sailors trapped in Oklahoma, cutting into the capsized hull to reach those pounding from inside. She served as an impromptu headquarters for recovery operations. She had survived the first blow of the Pacific War, but she would not be quiet. In weeks, Maryland steamed to the Puget Sound Navy Yard. She was overhauled and modernized. New radar equipment was installed, her anti-aircraft batteries were greatly increased, additional fire control equipment was installed. And now her crew grew in numbers and, most importantly, experience. And then, in February 1942, she sailed back to the Pacific, transformed and ready for revenge. The war that had come so unannounced onto her decks would now take her thousands of miles of ocean, from Tarawa to Saipan, from Leyte to Okinawa. USS Maryland, the peacetime fortress, had become something entirely different, a veteran, a survivor, and soon, a warrior without equal. The United States was no longer on the defensive. What began with surprise and devastation at Pearl Harbor had turned into a grinding counteroffensive across the vast Pacific. One coral island, one jungle atoll, one enemy airfield at a time. The campaign was slow, brutal, and unforgiving. And Maryland, rebuilt, rearmed, and reborn, was about to enter the thick of it. Her first true taste of battle would come at Tarawa, in the Gilbert Islands, November 1943. This would be the first major amphibious assault against a heavily fortified Japanese position. The defenders were dug in. Pillboxes, concrete bunkers, gun emplacements, reinforced with months of preparation. They believed their island fortress was impregnable. The Marines who landed at Tarawa would suffer horrendous casualties. Many drowned in the surf. Others were cut down on the beaches. But offshore, Maryland brought down hell upon the defenders. Her massive 16-inch guns opened fire in carefully timed barrages. Each shell weighed over a ton. Entire bunkers disappeared in clouds of sand and debris. The thunder of her broadside echoed across the lagoon as she fired hundreds of rounds into the shore, but bombardment alone was not enough. Japanese soldiers, often buried deep in the ground or protected by concrete roofs, survived the initial blasts. The fighting on land raged for 76 hours and cost over 3,000 American casualties. Still, Tarawa fell, and Maryland had proven herself. She had not only survived Pearl Harbor, she had become a cornerstone of American naval firepower. From Tarawa, the Navy moved west. In January 1944, the next target was the Marshall Islands, Kwajalein and Roi. Again, Maryland was there. As part of the pre-invasion bombardment force, she shelled Japanese airfields, fuel depots, and gun batteries. Her fire was directed by spotter planes flying overhead, often under enemy fire themselves. These observers would relay coordinates, and within moments, the earth on those coordinates would erupt in flame and steel. In one day, Maryland fired over 200 rounds from her main battery. Her gunners worked around the clock. When the Marines landed, they found many of the coastal defenses shattered. Success here would become a model for future invasions, where battleships would act as floating artillery, softening up targets before the infantry went ashore. But the further west the Navy moved, the harder the Japanese resistance became. June 1944. Saipan. This was no small island. It was part of the Marianas, strategically vital. From Saipan, American bombers could reach the Japanese home islands. The enemy knew this. They turned Saipan into a fortress, manned by over 30,000 defenders, including Japanese Army, Navy, and even civilian militia. Maryland arrived as part of Task Force 52. She began her bombardment on June 14th. The Japanese responded with air attacks. On June 18th, enemy aircraft launched a series of raids against the invasion fleet. The sky turned into a battleground. Maryland's gunners were no longer just pounding land targets, they were defending themselves. Her radar-guided 5-inch guns, supplemented by dozens of 40mm and 20mm anti-aircraft weapons, filled the air with shrapnel and noise. At least 2 enemy aircraft were brought down by her fire, but it wasn't just guns that earned her reputation. It was her endurance. Day after day, she remained offshore, supporting the Marines inching their way across Saipan. The terrain was mountainous, the resistance fanatical. Japanese soldiers launched banzai charges. Civilians were forced into suicide by propaganda and fear. It was a horrifying campaign. But Maryland stood her ground, firing when called upon, delivering precision strikes just yards from friendly troops. When Saipan finally fell, over 29,000 Japanese defenders lay dead. The cost for the United States was steep, almost 3,500 Marines killed. But the Marianas were now in American hands, and the war was about to reach a turning point. October 1944. The invasion of Leyte in the Philippines. This was more than just another island, it was the return of General Douglas MacArthur. It was a signal that the liberation of the Philippines had begun. And it would trigger the largest naval battle in human history. There would be 4 separate naval engagements that would erupt in the waters around the Philippines, Sibuyan Sea, Cape Engano, Samar, and Surigao Strait, and in the Surigao Strait, Maryland would take part in the last battleship versus battleship duel in history. On the night of October 24th, a Japanese force led by the battleships Yamashiro and Fuso, supported by cruisers and destroyers, attempted to force their way through the narrow waters of the Surigao Strait. Their goal, break into Leyte Gulf and destroy the vulnerable American landing forces, but waiting for them was a powerful defensive line, several US and Australian cruisers and destroyers, backed by 6 battleships, and among them, USS Maryland. The Japanese entered the trap around 3 a.m. USPT boats struck first, followed by torpedoes from destroyers. Then came the big guns. Maryland, guided by radar, opened fire from over 20,000 yards. Her 16-inch guns belched fire and thunder. Each salvo took 30 seconds to load, aim, and fire. The darkness was split by flashes of light, and the roar of naval artillery echoed across the strait. Shells rained down on the Japanese ships. Yamashiro was hit repeatedly. Fuso broke apart and sank. Those Japanese ships that survived turned and fled. In minutes, it was over. The last line battle between battleships in human history had ended, and Maryland had fired one of the final salvos. Yet even as her gunners exhaled and her barrels cooled, the war refused to end. The Japanese had changed tactics. Unable to match the US Navy ship for ship, they turned to desperation: the kamikaze. Suicide aircraft, piloted by men who believed death in battle was the highest honor. Their goal: crash into American ships, explode on impact, and cripple the enemy's advance, and Maryland would soon feel the fury of this terrifying new weapon. The Japanese Empire, once expansive and confident, was cornered, bleeding territory and ships. But instead of surrender, Japan reached deeper into its own mythology. It summoned not strategy, but sacrifice: the kamikaze, divine wind, men trained not to return. Planes packed with explosives. Pilots sworn to crash into American ships with deliberate, fiery death. The first major wave of kamikaze attacks struck during the Leyte campaign in the Philippines. By November 1944, nearly every ship in the area had to be on constant alert. Radar pickets, smoke screens, and anti-aircraft fire were the only barriers between survival and obliteration. On November 29, 1944, Maryland was off the coast of Leyte, supporting ongoing land operations. The day was clear. The crew, already seasoned by months of bombardment and battle, were at their stations, scanning the skies. Suddenly, an alert. Low, fast, incoming, a Japanese single-engine aircraft dove steeply out of the clouds. It had evaded radar, weaving between bursts of anti-aircraft fire from escorting ships. It zeroed in on Maryland. The gunners opened fire. 20mm and 40mm tracers arced through the sky, but it was too late. The kamikaze struck the ship near her port bow, just below the main deck. The explosion was immediate, deafening. A flash of fire, a rain of shrapnel, screams, smoke. The impact tore through several compartments, disabling machinery, igniting secondary fires, and blowing holes in the forward bulkheads. The bow began to flood. Salt water surged in. Her crew fought to contain the damage, but it became quickly apparent Maryland could no longer steam forward under her own power. The propulsion systems for her forward direction were crippled. The engineers, working against rising water and failing light, made an extraordinary decision. Rather than wait for tugs or tow lines, they reversed her remaining propulsion and shifted all power to the rear drives. Maryland began to move backward. For days, she would navigate in reverse, carefully backing away from the front lines towards safer waters, all while maintaining watertight integrity. It was an eerie sight, this massive warship, smoke still curling from her wounds, inching backward like a wounded giant that refused to fall. Tugs finally met her offshore and assisted in guiding her toward Puget Sound Naval Shipyard in Washington State. She had survived again. But she was far from done. At the shipyard, repairs were swift and decisive. Her bow was patched and reinforced. Anti-aircraft batteries were upgraded yet again. And then she returned to sea. February 1945, Maryland sailed west once more, just in time for the next great crucible, Iwo Jima. Iwo was a volcanic rock, a hellish place unlike any island before. The Japanese had transformed it into an underground fortress, filled with bunkers, hidden artillery, and spiderwebbing tunnels. On February 16th, Maryland opened fire. Day after day, she blasted known positions. Her 16-inch guns flattened terrain. Her 5-inch shells suppressed counterfire. And all the while, her crew stood by as spotter planes relayed targets. Smoke and flame poured from Mount Suribachi, and still, the enemy held on. For over a month, the Marines fought across Iwo Jima's black sands. Maryland remained close offshore the entire time, pouring fire onto Japanese strongholds until the last caves were cleared. Then came Okinawa, the final stepping stone to Japan itself. It was the largest amphibious invasion in the Pacific War, April 1, 1945. And with it came the largest kamikaze assault in history. Over 1,500 suicide aircraft were launched over the course of the campaign. Battleships, carriers, destroyers, no ship was spared. Maryland was hit again. On April 7, a second kamikaze plane dove toward her with terrifying speed. The gunner struck it before it could directly hit, but the explosion was close enough to pepper the ship with debris and shrapnel. Casualties were reported. Damage control parties scrambled to seal off punctured compartments, but Maryland did not leave station. She remained in her fire support role, holding position for weeks as the fighting on land raged on. The Okinawa campaign would cost over 12,000 American lives. But it broke the last resistance outside the Japanese homeland, and then, silence, August 6, 1945. Hiroshima. August 9, Nagasaki. The atomic bombs ended what even Maryland's guns could not. Japan surrendered on August 15, and once more, the great ship was ordered to sea. This time, not for war, but for peace. In September 1945, Maryland sailed into Tokyo Bay. On September 2, she dropped anchor just yards away from the USS Missouri, where the formal Japanese surrender was signed. Her flags flew proudly. Her decks were manned in dress whites. Her guns, silent at last, bore witness to history. It was the end of one era and the twilight of another. Maryland would serve several more years, participating in Operation Magic Carpet, bringing American troops home from across the Pacific, but the age of battleships was over. Aircraft carriers now ruled the seas. Jet planes and nuclear submarines would define the future. In April 1947, USS Maryland was decommissioned and placed in reserve. She sat quietly in the Pacific Reserve Fleet for over a decade, maintained, but never reactivated. In 1959, she was struck from the Naval Vessel Register, and in 1961, after more than 40 years of service, she was sold for scrap. But her legacy endures. She was born in the shadow of one world war, and nearly destroyed at the dawn of another. She survived Pearl Harbor. She fought at Tarawa, Saipan, Leyte, and Okinawa. She dueled enemy battleships, she withstood suicide attacks, and even when her bow was shattered, she reversed course, not just physically, but symbolically, refusing to be silenced, refusing to be sunk. USS Maryland was not the flashiest ship in the fleet, but she was without question one of the most resilient, an iron ship. With an iron soul. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe. You can also explore our channel for other battleship videos. Goodbye for now, and Godspeed.